Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. A new foreign policy think tank will start business challenging foreign policy orthodoxies. It is called the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. This is not an ordinary think tank. It is funded by Charles Koch and George Soros, among others. Talk about strange bedfellows. Can these establishment billionaires take on the foreign policy blob? Cross-talking strange bedfellows. I'm joined by my guest, Don DeBar in New York. He's host of the CPR News, a daily radio newscast. In London, we have Indrajit Palmar. He is a professor of international politics at City University of London with research interests in American foreign policy and its think tanks, as well as author of several books, including Think Tanks and Power in Foreign Policy and Foundations of the American Century. And in Oxford, we cross to Ted See. He is a senior policy consultant at British American Security Information Council, retired U.S. diplomat, and an expert on strategic intelligence and conflict resolution. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let me go to London. We were talking before this recording about the novelty of this Quincy Institute coming into being. The media has commented on us, obviously, because of the who's going to be funding it, someone very much to the left and somebody very much to the right. Before we talk about the principles involved in it, what do you think of the idea itself? I mean, it is coming out against endless wars that do not need to be started in the first place. I mean, there is a niche for it, and I'm all for it. I raise my hand in agreement. We'll talk about what's problematic about it. Go ahead, in London.
Yeah, I think when I read about it in the last couple of days, it was a surprising development. But when one kind of sits down and thinks about it a bit more, it's quite clear that since the end of the Cold War, and particularly since 9/11, there have been tendencies on both right and left, and probably longer as well, if you look at the Cato Institute, and right through after the Iraq War and into Libya, there's been a kind of growth of a kind of right-wing anti-military intervention feeling among military families and so on, in the Tea Party including that, as also against military spending, and as well as on the left. So I think it's interesting that we've got this kind of union occurring at this particular time. So it's a very interesting development, and we need to wait a little bit longer to see exactly what the principles are and how they're going to be put into practice. But to say that you are against endless wars, which has been a big complaint of most Americans really for the last 25 years or so, I think that is a very progressive principle. But we need to see the practice as well.
Let me go to Ted. It could be a very conservative principle as well. There's a lot of conservatives like me that are against these foreign interventions, and I've been making a living on this for 10 years on this program, fighting against these senseless wars. Ted, what is your reaction to the Quincy Institute? Because, I mean, on the face of it, yeah, this is a good idea. I'm just a little worried about the funding of it. Go ahead, Ted in Oxford.
I'm not particularly worried about the sources of funding. I find it interesting that two such disparate sources have both decided this is a good idea, but that doesn't stop me from thinking that it's a good idea too. And looking at the contributors, I see an Andrew Bacevich, who's very much along my lines of sort of conservative libertarian on a lot of international issues. I see Parsi from Georgetown, with whom I agree on almost nothing. But the whole idea, I would think, is to have people of various points of view coming together to discuss these issues and get people outside of their echo chambers.
That's wonderfully put. Don, okay, I'm going to start throwing some cold water on it here. Okay, you have George Soros and his relationship with the Atlantic Council. That is the mouthpiece of NATO. It's staunchly anti-Russian. If you look at the Koch brothers, they've been supporting this illegal coup in Venezuela. I could go on and on. Okay, so I'm left bewildered by all of this, because are they going to separate themselves from their business interests, and this is just be an intellectual process? I find that hard to believe. Go ahead, Don.
Well, the question is this a strategic change or a tactical one? And I'd argue clearly it's the latter. Their interests, as you mentioned, haven't really changed. The playing field has changed. The rules of the game have changed. We've seen expressions of this certainly in the 2016 election, when you saw Trump, who wasn't even a Republican really, rise on to the top of 16 candidates in the Republican Party, essentially because people said, as they told me at the RNC, he said he's going to get me a job. That's how desperate people were. You saw Sanders rise in the Democratic Party the same way, and you saw, and over the same issues, essentially, and you saw people in the streets every time something happened, when a kid got killed or some other event happened, people had one foot out the door already. The institutions in the West have not been responsive to the needs of working people for at least one generation now, 30 years, 40 years. You've seen a steady erosion of people's purchasing power and their wealth, their equity, so that now people who used to own their homes or have a very secure rental place to live are home insecure, they're food insecure, they have massive debt for education, they have healthcare insecurity, and there's no solution in sight. The thing that really got me at the RNC, when people said to me, well, Trump said he's going to get me a job, and I said, look, he's a politician. What does that mean? They said, no one else is even saying that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let me go back to London. Indrajit, I mean, you know, if we look at in the past few weeks here, and I don't want to micromanagement too much, but it seems quite obvious that Donald Trump is looking for other advice outside of his inner circle, because I would argue, and argue strenuously, that he's getting very bad advice from his inner circle, and he should do a lot of firing, I would say, and I think everyone knows who I'm talking about. With the Quincy Institute, that could be a new source for Trump to, you know, you guys kind of talk about both sides here. I think they see themselves as a niche, and I think they would find themselves, they could get closer to power. And that's exactly what think tanks want to do. They want to get their ideas in front of people who have power. And I think this is a very good gambit, as long as it's a good idea that they're pushing. Go ahead in London.
I think you're right. I think when we look at some of the scholars and what they've been saying about American foreign policy and its overreach in the last 20, 25 years, they come from both the right and from the liberal kind of part of the spectrum. So Steve Walt at Harvard, Tony Smith at Tufts, for example, are very representative. And what each of them is saying is that they basically fundamentally agree that America has been trying to do good in the world, but they would argue that there's been a lot of hubris involved too, and overstretch. And they're both urging restraint. And one of the key things that Steve Walt says in his book, The Hell of Good Intentions, for example, is that there is no, if you like, set of cadres or trained people from a kind of more realist perspective that the any administration in Washington can really choose from. And in his book, towards the end, he virtually puts forward a manifesto which would suggest how that set of cadres might be generated. And we know that in that book, Hell of Good Intentions, Steve Walt actually acknowledges the support, the financial support of the Koch Foundation in any case. So I think that is exactly what is happening here. And I think that will kind of possibly bolster some sorts of advice that President Trump may get to back up some of his own instincts.
Ted, Bill Kristol came out with a solid criticism, a very opinionated one as usual, coming from Bill Kristol. He accuses the idea of the Quincy Institute is promoting isolationism. So, I mean, I find that just absolutely absurd. Rethinking a failed foreign policy is not isolationism. It's always the 1930s for Bill Kristol. Go ahead in Oxford.
Dear. Yeah, it's a case of same stuff, different day from Kristol, I'm sorry to say. Look, this is a necessary point of view being put forward, and it has been put forward individually by a number of people. And when you find people as disparate as Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders agreeing on American military foreign policy, needing to take a back seat to American diplomatic foreign policy, and I say that as a diplomat of 26 years experience with the U.S. Foreign Service, then I think something good is blossoming here. Now, if we're still worried about the Koch brothers and Soros, you know, $500,000 each, that's a rounding error on their petty cash account, okay? They're not deeply invested here, but they're certainly making a point of investing, and I think there's a difference.
Okay, Don, you seem to be more of the skeptic on the program. React to that.
Well, first, you know, the objective conditions are such that imperial retreat is, you know, on the agenda of necessity. And Trump represents that, certainly the policy that he espoused and that he muttered out loud about, all the heresies that he spoke that provoked such a massive response from the elites here had to do with imperial retreat. Is NATO obsolete? Can't Japan defend itself? Do we have to have military bases all over the world? Do we need to have war games around Korea all the time? They're so expensive. You know, he's looking at, or in any event, whoever's making policy around are looking at the overhead of empire and seeing it as a drag on an economy that is out trying to compete with China that has no such drag. So you have that objective condition. Now you have people like Soros and the Koch brothers and others who resisted very strongly Trump articulating this. Soros wrote almost the same things back in 2003. In December, he wrote a piece in 2003 called The Bubble of American Power or Exceptionalism or some such thing, but criticized the war in Iraq and similar wars.
Yeah, but Don, but at the same time, Soros, there's solid evidence that he was funding NGOs in Ukraine, in Georgia. I mean, that's furthering an agenda, and it's a NATO agenda. Okay, so I mean, I could really care less about his op-eds. I care about how he spends his money, and that's why I brought up the money, because $500,000 is not a lot to him, but it can be a lot for people in Ukraine and Georgia. Go ahead, 10 more seconds. Go ahead.
Op-ed, and so that's exactly my point. Right now, we're talking about another op-ed. Let's see what kind of policy comes out of it and where he stands on it.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on strange bedfellows. Stay with RT.
Magic mushrooms used out of context, used in the wrong way, carry potential harms like any psychoactive substance. But used in the right way, they seem to have quite a profound therapeutic potential and quite a good safety profile as well.
My son was doing drugs. My nephews was doing drugs. My sisters were doing drugs. It was like an epidemic of drug abuse.
America's public enemy #1 in the United States is drug abuse.
We started going after the users, and the prison population soared. We started treating sick people who were addicted to these drugs like criminals.
While I was on the Hill, I increasingly became convinced that the war on drugs was a mistake. There are countless numbers of people who are in prison for inconceivably long sentences for being minor offenders in the drug trade.
It's a lot watching your children grow up and miss you and wave and say bye, Daddy, as they're walking out of a visit. It's just, it doesn't get easy.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing strange bedfellows. Okay, let's go back to London. Inderjeet, one of the problems here is I think we've all described the current situation with think tanks and how they influence policy, but that's for a good reason, because the military-industrial complex really likes it here. I mean, Don was absolutely right about the condition of the American public, okay, over the last 40 years or so. I have no disagreement with it whatsoever. On the flip side here, there's some people, a small group of people that are become fabulously rich off of this gambit, and the status quo is just Jim Dandy with them. That's why when Trump says he's going to pull out of Syria, Washington went into a meltdown. I mean, absurdly so. But that was patently obvious that there's a lot of money at stake here, and they don't want that to go away, because they need a threat. They need a threat to stay in business. I don't think they necessarily want to go to war, but they want to have a threat. They have to have multiple threats here. How can a think tank like the Quincy Institute fight against that? Because that is really the beast you have to slay, and it is a David and Goliath situation. You can have these wonderful manifestos, and good people like ourselves in our audience will read it, but will it have any impact? Go ahead.
Well, I think the first thing I would say to that, Peter, is that I don't think we should dichotomize the new think tank from the military-industrial complex. I suspect that this is a readjustment or recalibration of elements of that, and the fact is that there's a self-perpetuating character to kind of the existing think tank community and its relations with big corporations and so on, and that has actually led America down a kind of a dead end. When you look around the world, the United States, despite having spent so much money on so many wars, has lost positions, whereas other countries which have not waged wars on anything like that kind of scale are actually improving their positions. So I think what is going on here is really a kind of self-criticism from groups which are slightly outside of the mainstream establishment, which are arguing that actually America stands to lose even more position unless there's a recalibration. So the likes of Steve Walt and others, whose work I know well, who are arguing for a new position, is not that the US retreats away from the world, but what Walt basically argues is that basically you park your aircraft carriers in three key spaces, which are all at sea, which is in East Asia regarding China, that is a threat, in Persian Gulf in regard to Iran and other countries, and in northwestern Europe in regard to Russia. So it's not like that there aren't people in this new conglomeration who are not arguing about existing threats. They're just saying that there are different ways in which we can conceive of threats and deal with them, and thereby maintain American global power through a policy of a bit more restraint than liberal hegemony has been doing over the past 25 to 30 years. So I don't think it's a kind of fundamental challenge. I think it's a recalibration. But politically, they will have a lot of problems because there's an entrenched elite which has got great levels of power. And that is what this is a titanic battle, I think, beginning within.
Ted, you were nodding your head in agreement. What were you agreeing with? Go ahead.
Pretty much all of the above, but I'm thinking that what's called for here is not a realignment, it's not a retrenchment, it's actually a massive paradigm shift because it's going to take that to get people out of that old way of thinking. And frankly, a think tank which is dedicated to demilitarizing and bringing diplomacy up is pretty much an ideal bench to start doing experiments in paradigm shifting. Now, what I'm thinking is we have to get away from what I call the parabellum paradigm, which is this idea that's been with us for at least a century and a half, that it's necessary to continually prepare for war to achieve peace. And the classic quote there is probably JFK saying, "We dare not tempt them with weakness." But what no one ever seems to focus on is the other side of that same coin, which is we dare not terrify them into attacking us preemptively. And God knows that's happened before. Now, this has been a bad idea ever since the Crimean War, and it's still a bad idea that saber rattling is somehow going to improve diplomacy. And what we need instead is a new way of looking at things. And I actually think that as a businessman, Donald Trump is ideally suited to be sort of benevolently in the background running things while these new ideas are coming forward, because he'd much rather be trading with Moscow than pointing missiles at them.
That's a very good point. Don, I mean, some people have argued this Quincy Institute, it's a Trojan horse. I mean, it will say one thing, but really what it wants is to be able to walk the corridors of power. What do you say to that?
Well, you have to consider both the intent of the parties and then the actual role that it's going to play in events that are still unfolding, regardless of the intent of the parties. You know, again, it's a reaction to the reality of rising multipolarity, you know, this system sort of collapsing under the weight of its own history with military budgets, with, you know, placement of troops and materiel in 800 bases around the world. The expense of maintaining empire, you know, has made empire almost not profitable. And so what they're trying to do, in my opinion, at least some small part or some part of the elite is looking to either not just reevaluate the tactical mode of attaining global hegemony, but the question of whether or not hegemony should be the goal, and rather if there can be a more collegial way of managing the affairs of the planet. And so, you know, I see the United States, for example, going to sit at the table with a dozen other players, that are major players.
Yeah, but Don, that would be the paradigm shift that Ted is talking about. Looking at your interlocutor as some kind of equal, a peer. That is a very difficult thing for American foreign policy. I mean, Republican or Democrat. That is the paradigm shift, I think, that needs to be overcome and accepted, because essentially you have people like Bolton and Pompeo is that their idea of negotiating is you surrender, then we talk. That's what needs to change here. Go ahead, Don.
And so what is their intent, basically? Is it the intent of Soros and Koch and whoever else is involved in this to use this to facilitate their way through this moment to attain hegemony? In other words, is it just a feint to, acknowledge the existing situation in an attempt to change it? Or is this, basically like I've heard others say here, an attempt, to run a lab, and let's see if we can't come up with some things that will help us accommodate ourselves to a new paradigm.
Yeah. Let's go back to one of the things that's very interesting that I think that the people that are we've mentioned some of the people associated with this Quincy Institute, is that they have their pulse, their finger on the pulse of public opinion. Public opinion repeatedly there's an exhaustion when it comes to these foreign adventures that never end, are never successful, are terribly expensive. And there's a reminder, what is it? I mean, I've heard conflicting numbers. Numerous veterans every single day commit suicide, every single day. And that is a legacy that is left on the home front here. So it seems to me, and I want to be hopeful here and optimistic, but these people that are involved, slightly to the left, slightly to the right, they understand that the American people have had enough of this, and they don't need the Boltons and the Pompeos and people like that whispering in the president's ear, going for another conflict that nobody in the heartland really wants. And they certainly doesn't create jobs for them in a meaningful sense. Go ahead in London.
Yeah, I think broadly I would agree, but I would just note a bit of caution on President Trump. Now, President Trump has been the president who has called for a withdrawal of troops from Syria as well as Afghanistan, did halt the attack on Iran, he claims, within 10 minutes of it being launched. But on the other hand, President Trump has boosted the military spending, backed by the Democrats, very heavily. He has also broadened the range of tools American power uses in order to try to bring other powers to heel, whether they are allies or associated or they are seen as strategic rivals. So I don't think this grouping necessarily thinks very differently fundamentally from that. That is to say that there is a growing sort of shift in world distribution of power. There are new rising powers and so on. But at the same time, I think the idea is that military intervention hasn't really worked. And what you really need is a large amount of power, a variety of powers, which include diplomatic, but also commercial, financial, dollar and other, in order to effectively try to subordinate the other powers in a system which looks a little bit more multipolar, but actually will remain the kind of US remains the first among so-called equals. So I would think that President Trump is actually actively trying to do that in his own incoherent way. And that is what I think many people who are critics of him from the right suggest that he is, that he's unable to see anything through to the end because he's got a number of other personal and other kinds of issues going on as well. So I would suggest that this grouping is not going to lead to any kind of idea of endless war, but I think they're going to be much more selective about military engagement.
Oh, one should hope.
Believe me, I believe that they're going to be spending a lot of money on American military going forward.
Well, it's not going to be easy to reverse this, or as Ted said, this paradigm shift here. Ted, jump in and finish off the program for us. Go ahead.
Well, I tend to be more optimistic, including about President Trump, who's entirely coherent if you look at him from a business perspective. He's not terribly good about this world domination through military thing. If he's acceded to requests from his own government, then frankly, he's still surrounded by quite a bit of the deep state, and he hasn't managed to purge all of that from his own Department of Energy, from his own Department of Defense, from his own intelligence community, and he's going to be some time finishing that particular job, as the rumors floating around that DOJ and FBI are still after him for some unknown reason at this point. So a paradigm shift can take place with the right intentions, with a bit of backing, and that's why I'm glad there's some finance behind this. But we have to back away from the idea that it's just going to be an endless, red tooth and claw ascendancy as the next generation of, overlords comes along. I don't think that's going to be the paradigm that any of us will be dealing with 50 years from now. I think we're going to be trading with each other. I think we're going to lift African farmers out of poverty by stopping agricultural subsidies in Europe and other places. I think we're actually going to start acting like this is the 21st century and that we don't need NATO and other relics of dead empire to spend all of our money on for no purpose.
Well, we'll end on those beautiful words that you just uttered there. Thank you, gentlemen. We're run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in New York, London, and in Oxford. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.